On this episode, we look at an intersection with a good design for blind pedestrians in Binghamton, New York. Then we look at an intersection that almost got it right in Davis, California. We see how bioswales are used to absorb stormwater along streets in Portland, Oregon. And finally, we talk with the police chief and business owners about problems crossing the street in Port Orford, Oregon. Stay tuned.
We're in Binghamton, New York, talking with Erin Cavanaugh, who's an orientation and mobility specialist. What does an O&M specialist do?
Essentially, I work with people who are blind and visually impaired, and we focus on mobility skills and orientation skills.
And what sort of skills does a blind pedestrian need to get around?
A blind pedestrian on the street, in an outdoor environment, whether familiar or unfamiliar, has a number of challenges, and probably the biggest is intersections, because there's a lot of big moving vehicles that can be very dangerous.
So what's this intersection behind us, and what are the characteristics of it that make it a little easier for a blind pedestrian to get across?
The intersection behind us is the intersection of Court Street, Holly Street, and Water Street. It does form basically a plus sign, so it's a very traditionally shaped intersection. The characteristics of this intersection that make it very pedestrian friendly are audible pedestrian signals to start with, or accessible pedestrian signals, I should say. Every corner has two crossings, so each crossing is separated, has a separate pole with a separate pedestrian signal and a separate ramp. The poles are situated in such a way that the pedestrian can stand directly beside the pedestrian signal and have either their hand on the signal or be very close to hear any of the audible output and still be in a very good position to cross the street. The pole isn't far away from the intersection. Its location makes it extremely accessible for people in wheelchairs, for people who are blind who take a lot of time to set up their crossing direction and then don't want to move their feet, but still want access to the information from the pedestrian signal. Somebody who can't, who is hard of hearing and may not be able to hear the signal, can place their hand on the pedestrian signal and it will vibrate when the light is turned green. So the placement of the pole and the signal itself is extremely important. Pole in relation to the ramp, and the ramp in relation to the direction of the crosswalk. There's many ramps that are these big sort of open radius ramps that encompass an entire corner, and they don't provide any direction whatsoever. In fact, most wheelchair users will get into one of those ramps, find themselves in the middle of the intersection, and then coming back to the crosswalk because the slope of the ramp hasn't sent them into the crosswalk, it's sent them into the middle of the intersection. So those separated directional ramps are very important.
So the same characteristic that pointing people toward the crosswalk can be good both for blind pedestrians and wheelchair users.
Absolutely, and I would say for most pedestrians. It makes it very clear that this button and this ramp is specifically for this crosswalk, and that kind of information can be difficult for a lot of pedestrians, for young people who are learning how to cross streets, for older people who aren't processing information as quickly. It's a pretty fast-paced world. You want some of these things, especially when it comes to dealing with cars, to be straightforward. And to have a button and a ramp and a crosswalk that are all very clearly laid out is beneficial for pedestrians. Also, at the bottom of the ramp, we have the detectable warning surfaces in each ramp. A lot of people don't know what they are, but they're similar to the reason why ramps were put in so that wheelchair users could get down curbs. That ramp is now flush with the street, and that can make it difficult for a person who's blind or visually impaired to detect exactly where the street starts and the sidewalk ends. So detectable warning surfaces were put in. They're little bumpy pads at the base. They're also, there's a color contrast there for people who are low vision so they can see them as well. But studies have shown that the height of the bumps and the spacing of the bumps makes them detectable to cane users.
And they're called truncated domes in this country, or the British call them blister pavement.
Oh, yeah.
And the Japanese also independently, all three countries independently came across this particular device, and which tells you that maybe there's something going on there if everyone seems to come up with it independently. So what are some of the other things that work well at this intersection?
They have clearly defined crosswalks that are defined both in color contrast as well as tactual pavement. They've stamp paved the sides of the crosswalks, and to make the crosswalks, those are on the edges. So you have a line of paint, and then you have a line of stamped concrete, which can provide some textural differences. Not the greatest. Studies have shown that cane users aren't necessarily sensitive to that, but the actual brick can be very difficult for wheelchair users, so that's a line that planners and engineers really have to ride. So in this case, what they've done is they've put in what looks like sidewalk blocks, which are fairly smooth except for the odd crack, and on the edges they've put in that stamped concrete and then the additional color contrast with the big white paint.
And I think you have a couple of important things there. First of all, the white paint, because drivers can't see the pavement very well. They need the white paint still.
Yep.
And the bumpy surface is at the edge and not the middle.
Yes.
So many people like to make the whole crosswalk bumpy, which is not necessarily what you want to do.
Right. That can be beneficial because it can alert drivers to the fact that they're in a crosswalk, and depending on the aesthetic of the area, that might work out, but it really doesn't work well for wheelchair users or anybody who has a mobility impairment, because that's a very uneven surface. So in the end, what ends up being best is something bumpy on the outside and then a nice smooth path in the middle.
And actually, bumpiness for drivers, by the time they're driving over the crosswalk,
they're done.
It's too late. You need to have seen it ahead of time with that white paint.
That's true.
So then you have a lot of intersections that aren't this good.
Yeah.
What are the typical problems that that a blind pedestrian comes across at an intersection that's not been designed this well?
Okay, well, one of the first things that you're paying attention to when you approach an intersection, you do want to know where the edge is so that you don't step into the street. So there's your detectable warning surface. You want to make sure that your line is correct, that you know where the other side of the street is, and that you're going to cross parallel with traffic. So approaching the intersection on a straight line can help you maintain that line when you're crossing, because there aren't very many tactual ideas of straight across the street. You can listen to your traffic if there is some, but if there isn't, you're really relying on your ability to hold a straight line with no vision. And that can be very challenging for some people. So that approach is very important. If you approach an intersection and you've got your line and you're doing what you're taught to do, and then you get there and the ramp is on an angle that points you in a different direction, then you're being forced to fight the angle of the ramp to maintain your line, which is a very difficult thing to do and can throw a lot of people off, which can basically end up having you walk across an intersection in the middle, or perhaps veer off into the perpendicular street. And so a ramp that points you into the intersection makes things a lot easier, and that's not very common either. The majority of intersections I see, the ramp is simply to allow people to get down from the curb. It doesn't seem to have any other function. For people who are blind and visually impaired, having a ramp that very specifically lines you up with your crossing is very important. In association with that, if you are approaching your intersection and you've got your line, the last thing you want to do is start running around looking for a pole with a button because those pedestrian buttons are becoming very, very, very important. Signalization is much more advanced and complicated now, and really many of the intersections are actuated and require a pedestrian to push a button so that there can be a pedestrian cycle. Finding that button and maintaining your line can be a challenge, a very, very big challenge. In this case, we have the audible pedestrian signals at the intersection, and they have locator tones, so they beep and draw you towards the button. Now, because the button is placed in relation to the crosswalk, as you're approaching the intersection and you're heading towards the crosswalk that's sending you in the correct direction, the button is immediately there on your left and doesn't skew your line and allows you the information that you need to cross. Most intersections that I've seen, I can say, have buttons in very difficult places. I've seen buttons that are on the other side of what do you call those? retaining.
I've seen them behind guardrails,
Guardrails, that's the
behind
word.
drainage
Yes.
ditches,
Yes.
behind across 15 feet of muddy grass.
Completely inaccessible places, absolutely. So the button location is extremely important, especially if you're going to deal with audible signals where you don't want them to be too loud to drown out all the other traffic information that can help you decide when to cross the street. So if I were to emphasize anything, and in our partnerships here in town, what helped bring this about, the focus was on pole location. They were sold on the accessible pedestrian signal. That was an easy one. But encouraging the additional poles to be placed in the correct location with ramps that are very specifically designed in that way, that was a little more difficult for the engineers and the planners to understand, because it doesn't seem important, but they're small details that really make a huge difference.
So what was the process that got this done and done right?
We established partnerships. The gentleman you interviewed before, both of them, I sit on their committees. They have bike ped committees here for the MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization. Thank you. They have a committee, a bike ped committee, and I sit on that committee. And the local DOT has a committee as well, and I sit on that committee. And I just started waving the flag, saying, you know what, these are important pedestrian issues, and there needs to be a voice here. And they helped me, both of those committees helped hook me up with some of the local engineers and planners. So for this particular intersection, I worked with the Binghamton engineer, head engineer for the town, the planning engineer. And we stood out here at this intersection with plans in hand and talked about it. And I had my training cane with me, and I demonstrated the strategies and why the things I was asking for were important. And the engineer at the time really agreed and made sure it happened. That was Gary Holmes. Yeah.
So then, are you able then, with future intersection projects, to bring the engineer out here and show them what a good one looks like then?
Yes. I'm hoping everybody gets to see through this program what a good intersection looks like. We've had additional successes after this one. I will say that as the first, this one was the best. And unfortunately, there's a lot of turnaround in these fields. So where you can teach one person, and this is what I had to learn, you end up having to teach another one and another one and another one, and it becomes a job in and of itself. So we keep working at it, keep educating all the new people and all of the different construction companies and engineering companies and all the different people who work on the different intersections, because it's never the same people. It's nice to think it's going to be, but these projects really are long-term projects, and there's turnaround that happens throughout the span of one project that can change something as small as the orientation of a crosswalk.
Walk sign is on. Walk sign is...
We're at the corner of 1st and D Streets in Davis, California. This is an actuated signal, meaning that a pedestrian has to push a button to get the walk signal to come on. It's also an accessible pedestrian signal. That means that there's an audible tone so that a blind pedestrian can locate that push button. And also there's a message or a distinctive tone to let the blind pedestrian know that the walk light has come on. How well have they done at this intersection? First, note that there are 2 curb ramps at each corner, 1 for each crosswalk. This is usually the best way to do things because it means that a wheelchair user coming down the curb ramp is headed straight into the crosswalk and doesn't have to do a little turn at the bottom. But it also means that curb ramp can be used by a blind pedestrian to guide themselves in the right direction to go across the street. But where are the push buttons relative to those curb ramps? On the northeast corner, they're on a common pole between the 2 curb ramps. That can create some confusion because it means that the audio signals for a blind pedestrian are coming from about the same spot. In this case, the message tells you which street has the walk light, and so the confusion might not be as great as if there was just an indicator tone when the walk light went on.
1st Street. Walk sign is on to cross 1st Street.
But it would be far better to separate the push buttons and the tones. On the northwest corner, they've done that. They have a separate pole for each of the 2 push buttons. However, they still don't have it quite right. The push button for the right-hand ramp has been put right between the two curb ramps, where you still have that potential for confusion. The push button for the left-hand ramp has been put on the outside of the ramp, well away from the right-hand ramp, so there won't be any confusion about the tone. However, the pole with the push button is way down at the base of the ramp, meaning a wheelchair user has to stop while they're on the incline of the ramp to push the button. It can be a little awkward to be braking and pushing the button at the same time. On the remaining two corners, they've done a bit better. The poles for the push buttons are on the outside of the ramps, well away from the other ramp and crosswalk, so there won't be any confusion about which crosswalk the tone applies to. And they almost have the location right in terms of how far down they are on the ramp. Two of them are right at the top. The other two are partway down the ramp. A wheelchair user will still have to brake and push at the same time. As with so many other things in the pedestrian environment, it's the details that make all the difference. We're talking with Greg Raisman with the City of Portland Office of Transportation. What's going on behind us here?
Well, what we're looking at right now, John, is called an bioswale, where we're using a type of device called a bioswale that manages stormwater on site. And at the same time, we're using these and developing them as a traffic management and traffic safety tool. So this one is called an intersection realignment, where we used a bioswale that's managing about 5 blocks of stormwater and not going into our pipes to make it so that a pretty awkward curve in the street has much better lines. We're using it to channelize the cars, slow the traffic speed down, also to make a much higher pedestrian crossing. So it's going to increase safety, increase convenience, and also make it a lot more practical and easy place to use while we're dealing with an important environmental problem.
Now, why would stormwater be a problem for Portland?
Well, in Portland, it rains every once in a while. We actually get less inches of rain a year than New York City, but we get more days of rain than they do. And when our city was put together, this solution is actually handling 2 problems. The first one, which the system of these green streets we call them, we have a combined sewer and stormwater system where we have one pipe where both the sewerage and the stormwater goes. And as our city's grown, those pipes haven't, and so they're over capacity. And so one way to help with that problem is to make it so that the stormwater never gets to the pipes. And so we're using it to deal with that. At the same time, at this place, this curve is actually because of a survey error that happened in 1852. And by putting this intersection realignment in, we've been able to adjust the intersection to provide better information to people that are traveling down the street where to be and how to cross and how to travel along the street. And so we're able to combine those 2 solutions and really deal with the bad environmental problem we have, where when it rains and our system's over capacity, that means we have discharges into our river. And so right now we're building a 22-foot in diameter pipe. It's costing the city a very lot of money, $1.4 billion. At the same time, we're putting in hundreds of bioswales so that over time and through the future, we're both adding plant life, reducing the amount of hardscape in our city, and managing our stormwater in a much more friendly way.
We're talking with Mark Creighton, who's Chief of Police for Port Orford, Oregon. What sort of traffic problems do you have here in Port Orford?
Concerning pedestrians, the couple of the biggest problems we have that's different from other communities are that it's about a 2-mile stretch of roadway. You can see back here that it's a 4-lane highway. From the highway, and people traveling come from a 2-lane road into a 4-lane road, and they feel it's a passing zone. It's actually a community, so it drops from 55 to a 30-mile-an-hour zone, and traffic tends to go very fast through here. The pedestrian crosswalks aren't marked, and there's no stoplights in the community to help slow people down, so it's a straight-through drive for people, and we have a lot of pedestrians that use these particular roads, and we have some speeds up to 80+ miles an hour through this community from vehicles, which puts a pedestrian in extreme danger.
Do you get complaints from the community about getting across the road?
Yes, we have a lot of complaints. We just submitted some information to Oregon Department of Transportation to reinstall the crosswalks across here. We have a population of 1,190 people. We had 387 signatures on the petition that we sent up. So there's a big concern in the community for crosswalks. We're trying to get crosswalks placed at these 3 intersections here and to help pedestrians cross and make them a little more safer.
Now, what are you able to do in the way of enforcement?
Enforcement-wise, we are provided through the state with grants to work extra overtime hours for officers to do extra strategic enforcement at intersections. Technically, in Oregon, even if they're unmarked, there's a crosswalk there. It's an invisible crosswalk. So even if there's no crosswalk there, a pedestrian has the right of a person walking across a crosswalk. So we have people that we come out in a force of 3 or 4 police cars, and we'll park around these intersections and have a person walk out into traffic. We cone out an area far enough back so they have plenty of room to decide whether they should stop or not. And then we have a pedestrian walk across the street, and it's very dangerous, we find out, for that person during those crosswalk enforcement things.
What is sort of reaction you get from the violators that you stop?
The violators get upset. They're upset because they don't feel that if they don't see a crosswalk there, they don't feel that the pedestrian has a right to be there, so they just drive right by them and sometimes almost into them. They get upset when they're stopped. Majority of the people, what we have found, we've done this enforcement action. We do about 2 or 3 operations during the year, sometimes 4, and we found that most of the local people now are more in compliance and stop and take the extra time to look for pedestrians at these crosswalk areas.
So you have had some impact.
Yes, we've had some impact, and it's very observable when we're out on patrol now. A person steps out on the road, then we don't have to stop cars because they generally stop for them now.
Any tourists out there watching are going to be driving down the Oregon coast? What advice would you give them?
Well, my advice is to watch for the communities and watch for the signs. All these communities are signed and with speed limit signs, and all intersections on the highway within the city are marked crosswalks, whether they're marked or not. They're still crosswalks, and when people are traveling, we need to be watching the scenery, driving a little slower, enjoying our trip, and being respectful of other people in these communities that visitors pass through.
We're talking with Vicki Courtwright with McNair True Value Hardware. Store is located right on Highway 101. What do you see outside your window?
When we're in the store working and see people at the crosswalk, we always watch because the traffic is always coming by so fast. And we want to make sure that if they step off the corner, the cars are going to stop, which very seldom do they.
And do you hear complaints from your customers?
We hear a lot of complaints from our customers. A lot of our customers stop over at the laundromat to wash their clothes, and they'll come over and shop while they're washing. And it takes them forever to get across the street coming from the east to the west.
So what do you think could be done that might improve things?
Well, we were thinking if they would paint a crosswalk across there, it would at least make the cars coming into town aware that they've entered a city and they've entered a potential place, even though it's legal at any corner for a person to cross. If a crosswalk is marked, that maybe the cars would be more aware that that person standing there is actually wanting to cross the road.
What reaction have you gotten from the Department of Transportation when you've made suggestions like this?
In May 2002, I wrote the Department of Transportation a letter asking them to consider putting a crosswalk in at 20th Street in 101. And I got a letter back from them saying they put up the camera, there were not enough people using that corner to warrant painting a crosswalk across that corner.
And is it possible there's some people that might want to cross there that just don't because they feel so unsafe?
Yes, and we have people that sometimes need a little more help than others trying to cross that corner. and at older people, it's really intimidating for them to try to cross that corner, knowing the cars are coming, and they don't feel safe stepping off the curb trying to cross it.
We're talking with Jeff McFarland, who's owner of the Camp Blanco RV Park in Port Orford. Your customers come, they park their RV, they want to head out around town. What's it like for them?
Right now it's a challenge because we don't have any way to slow down the traffic to allow them to cross the street. Right now the main issue we have is we don't have any crosswalks, especially at this end of town.
And what sort of destinations would they be trying to get to that they would need to get across the street?
The main one is the laundromat right across the street from us, right across the highway. There's also a restaurant or two on the other side of the highway that they like to go visit. And other than that, it's crossing the highway to walk down towards the other end of town.
And so after they've been traveling for a week or two, they have a little bit of dirty laundry, and so they've got a challenge.
Right. And not having a place, like I say, where the traffic will slow down for them enough to safely cross is an issue.
And then how about your family? Can your kids get around?
Well, no, we have 3 kids, and right now we keep them on this side of the highway just because there is no safe place for them to cross. So we're pretty much have them grounded to this, the west side of the highway, and if they want to cross, typically we're out there with them and cross with them.
What have you been doing to try to get something done to remedy the situation?
Well, we've been here 5 years, and the former police chief we had asked and had kind of said that it was an ODOT issue. It had to be through the Oregon Department of Transportation. The current police chief we have is doing a great job of trying to help get these crosswalks put in, and so we're supporting him. Having petitions signed anywhere we can that will help his progress in getting these put in.
When the highway does get good crosswalks, things are done to slow down the traffic, what will that do for the experience of the people that are staying at your business?
It just makes a safer place for them to stay. It gives them a place where they know they can get around without having to worry about getting run over by a car. Especially the ones that come flying through town in a 30-mile-an-hour zone and don't slow down.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.